is the most resilient parasite? A bacteria? A virus? An intestinal worm?
What Mr. Cobb is trying to say?
An idea. Resilient, highly contagious. Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate.
Inception. Is it possible?
Of course not.
If you can steal an idea from someone's mind, why can't you plant one there instead?
Okay.
How complex is the idea?
Simple enough.
No idea is simple when you need to plant it in somebody else's mind.
My main competitor is an old man in poor health. His son will soon inherit control of the corporation. I need him to decide to break up his father's empire.
I will split up my father's empire. Now, this is obviously an idea that Robert himself would choose to reject, which is why we need to plant it deep in his subconscious. The subconscious is motivated by emotion, right? Not reason. We need to find a way to translate this into an emotional concept. An idea is like a virus, resilient, highly contagious, and the smallest seed of an idea can grow. It can grow to define or destroy you.
In the 2010 Christopher Nolan science fiction film Inception, professional thief Dominic Cobb specializes in the infiltration of men's dreams in order to steal ideas and information. Impressed by Cobb's unique abilities, the wealthy Japanese businessman Mr. Saito hires him for the near-impossible task of inception, the act of implanting an idea into a man's mind so that he believes it is his own. The target of this unprecedented assignment is Robert Fisher, the son and heir of Mr. Saito's dying business rival Morris Fisher, and its object is to convince him to dissolve the Fisher-Morrow conglomerate, his family's vast industrial empire. As an incentive, Saito promises Cobb that, should he succeed, he will intervene on his behalf to ensure that he is cleared of suspicion in the death of his late wife Mal, allowing Cobb to return to America and reunite with his children. When Morris dies, Cobb and his assembled team of specialists sedate Robert on a plane journey to America and enter his dreams. Inside, they find his subconscious mind guarded by dangerous psychic projections and are forced to fight their way through each layer of his mental world. When Saito is wounded during an ensuing gun battle, Cobb reveals that, should one die inside the dream, they would be trapped in limbo, an infinite subconscious from which there is no known escape. Meanwhile, as they struggle to stay alive, Cobb is mysteriously pursued by the vengeful ghost of Mal, who seeks to thwart their mission at every turn. Cobb reveals that he and Mal once entered into the dream together, living out an entire lifetime as they built a world of their own in its deepest reaches. Mal, however, slowly became convinced that the dream was her reality and refused to wake from it. In an effort to save her, Cobb performed the first act of inception inside Mal's mind, implanting an idea that would inadvertently cause her to doubt everything, even the real world. This mistake would eventually lead her to take her own life, in the hope that death would return her to the dream. After Cobb confronts Mal in limbo and finally comes to terms with his guilt over her death, her ghost is finally exorcised. Then, deep in the dream world, Robert encounters the implanted idea in the form of an illusion of his dying father, who in a moment of reconciliation tells him to seek his own path in life instead of following in his footsteps, freeing Robert from the legacy of Fisher-Morrow and his father's expectations. Cobb's team re-emerge into the real world, but Cobb stays behind in the dream to search for Saito, who is now trapped in limbo. When the two awaken upon the plane with mere hours having passed, a grateful Saito keeps his promise, and Cobb is able to return to America. Finally back home, he spins Mal's totem, a top that turns forever only in dreams, to determine whether he is truly in the real world. As the top spins, Cobb embraces his children without turning back to look at it. The metaphorical subtext of the story is simple. Morris and Robert Fisher represent Western man, past and future. The Fisher-Morrow Corporation is the wealth and legacy of Western civilization that is his birthright, and Cobb and his team of extractors are the forces of psychic subversion that seek, through the power of illusion, to deceive him into surrendering it. This is done through seeding a self-destructive idea in his subconscious mind, the titular act of inception. By the story's end, inception will be performed 3 times, once on Robert Fisher, once on Dom Cobb, and once on the unwitting audience. This makes the film both a metaphor for the subversive role of media in the modern world, and a meta-commentary on its own function and purpose. Our first indication of this narrative subcurrent is given when, in the film's opening scene, Cobb explains to Saito the concept of pathogenic ideas, likening them to contagious parasites that infect the mind. Later, we learn that such an idea can, through a process of psychic infiltration, be implanted into an individual human consciousness without the subject's knowledge of its external origin, so that he will think it to have arisen from his own being. This is most effectively done by covertly embedding the idea within a dramatically compelling dream story that draws on the subject's personal history and exploits his primal emotions. By employing this strategy, the subject of the act of inception can be led to embrace an idea that he would otherwise reject, one that has the power to define or destroy him. Over the course of Inception's story, its heroes will infiltrate Western man's collective consciousness in the personified form of Robert Fisher in order to sow within it one such idea: to split up my father's empire, that is to say, to sacrifice our civilizational inheritance. This psychic invasion is commissioned by Saito, a racial outsider and tribal competitor, and it is executed by a multiracial team of specialists, an allusion to the global character of the conspiracy against Western civilization. In pursuit of their subversive objective, this international partnership must wage war upon Western man's mental world, bypassing and breaking down his psychological defenses in order to gain access to his elemental emotional core. Only there, in the deepest reaches of his being, can the pathogenic idea be successfully implanted, and only through concealing it within a story tailored to his inmost desires will it take root and grow. Like modern Western man, Robert Fisher stands to inherit a vast and powerful empire built by his forebears, yet he fears shouldering the responsibility that this custodianship would entail. This fear is reflected in his strained relationship with his dying father Morris, a patriarchal personification of the old Western order and its fading values of strength and conquest. This archetypal juxtaposition between father and son serves as a coded allusion to the tensions between tradition and modernity, tribe and individual, duty and liberty that have defined recent Western history. It is only through exploiting this intrafamilial conflict and the generational divide that underpins it that Cobb and his extractors are able to craft a story designed to convince Robert that, by rejecting his ancestral birthright, he is not betraying his father's wishes, but fulfilling them, a lie designed to grant him the moral sanction he needs to dismantle his family's empire. Cobb, the mastermind of the Inception mission, represents the agents of social and cultural subversion that have affected this psychic transformation. This is most obviously reflected by his aforementioned part in manipulating Fisher to dissolve his family's legacy at the behest of a racial outsider. It is visually signified when, in a sequence loaded with symbolic connotations, Cobb unleashes destruction upon the historic streets of Paris, one of the archetypal symbols of the Western world. Later, as Cobb and his teammate Ariadne navigate its streets, Paris is made to turn in on itself, visually evoking the transgression of Western culture's norms and boundaries. Alluding to the need for subterfuge in waging this psychic warfare, Cobb warns Ariadne that the dream invader must conceal their presence and purpose from the people inside the dream at all times, lest they sense the foreign nature of the dreamer and attack like white blood cells, an admission that, if the targeted white audience were to become aware of the deception being perpetrated upon them, they would resist it violently. Dom, however, is not only an agent of Inception, but a subject of it. This is indicated when, in an early scene, we are told that in going deeper into Robert's mind, we are also going deeper into Dom's, implying a thematic mirroring between Robert and Dom and their intertwining storylines. Later, during the film's final act, the successful inception of Robert is juxtaposed against Dom's exorcism of Mal's ghost, hinting at a symbolic relationship between Fisher's rejection of his family's legacy and Cobb's overcoming of his past. These narrative parallels hint at a deeper metaphorical meaning to the film's story. Mal is a personification of Western man's past, a malevolent incarnation of the forces of regression and attachment that ostensibly threaten to destroy us. Mal and Dom's dream world is, therefore, a microcosmic metaphor for Western civilization and its historical trajectory. This world, we are told, had its time and met its fated end, only living on as a dangerous notion in the minds of its inheritors. And just as Robert Fisher must free himself from the burden of the familial birthright that denotes Western civilization's material inheritance, Cobb must free himself from Mal's mad ghost, its embodied legacy. The final overcoming of this past is signified when, after Mal is exorcised and Inception is successfully performed on Robert Fisher, we witness the simultaneous demolition of both Cobb's dream city and Fisher's mental fortress, denoting the end of Western civilization. The redemptive power of this act of destruction is symbolized both by the baptismal waters that engulf the dreamers as it awakens them, and by the absolution later given to Cobb when he passes through immigration in the film's closing scenes. Notably, this pardon for past sins is effected by Saito after Cobb descends into limbo to save him, suggesting that the white man will find moral redemption not only in the repudiation of his historical past, but in the self-sacrificial deliverance of the racial other. It is the natural goal of every life form to seek the means to perpetuate its own existence. Similarly, every dynamic human culture is driven by the need to ensure its future survival, and this is done through securing wealth and power for its posterity. Simply put, by attempting to coerce the targeted white audience into relinquishing this inheritance. Inception constitutes an incitement to civilizational suicide. It is a well-established truth that human behaviors are principally guided by subconscious emotional impulses rather than rational, conscious calculations. Moreover, because these foundational impulses exist apart from and prior to the logical scrutiny of the rational mind, they can be unconsciously reshaped and redirected through stories and images. In traditional cultures, one of the implicit functions of myth was to mold human behaviors in accord with healthy values that served to safeguard and enforce collective tribal interests. A people's myths constituted the creative expression of their shared beliefs and values, their common historical experiences, and their collective sense of national purpose. Myth thus served as the glue holding a given grouping together, providing it with identity, meaning, and direction. However, with the growing application of rational methods to the formation of stories within the mythic medium, subversive elements quickly realized that mythology's original vitalizing purpose could be distorted through the manipulation of its narrative tropes. This would be accomplished through using fiction to reassociate productive behaviors with negative material, personal, or spiritual outcomes, while associating destructive or self-destructive behaviors with positive outcomes. Through exposure to these memes, human instincts and impulses could be effectively reprogrammed. Moreover, fiction, which had hitherto served a productive social purpose, could now be used to present the possibility of pursuing an independent individual good, apart from or even opposed to the collective tribal good. In the course of Western man's historical ascendancy, we would with our creative power build a culture of unprecedented wealth, strength, and beauty, so that our civilization would become the world's envy. However, our enemies learnt that the greater the sum of this ancestral inheritance, the heavier the burden placed on those called upon to carry it into the future. Perceiving our apprehension in rising to this daunting task, they endeavored to leverage the very greatness of our legacy as a weapon against us, seeking to convince us that the weight of its charge was too heavy to bear. To this end, they first used their expanding control over our cultural institutions to work to give us cause to doubt our own strength. Then they turned our inheritance from a cause for pride and self-assurance into a source of shame and guilt, for which they knew we would seek absolution. Only then could we be tempted with the offer that, should we cease to shoulder our duty, our sins would be cleansed and our trials eased. Unable to conquer us with armies, our enemies ventured to conquer us with ideas. It was necessary, however, that Inception's true subversive purpose be artfully concealed by its authors, who by their own admission knew that should their audience truly understand what was being asked of them, they would choose to reject it. For this design they fashioned a story intended to coerce us into believing that, through our self-overthrow, we would find freedom from the burdens of the past and from the ghosts of our conscience. More, we would, in our abdication, each be liberated to walk untrammeled a new path of individual self-fulfillment, unbound by blood, duty, history, or truth. And though in this surrender we are called on to sacrifice our worldly power, this is, we are assured, a worthy price to pay in exchange for the redemption it will purchase. And just as an idea can destroy an individual, so too can it destroy a nation and a people. To break up our father's empire, this is the suicidal notion that has commandeered Western man's consciousness, shaping his thoughts and impulses and steering him without his knowledge. The irrational quest for its fulfillment guides not only our personal conduct, but the course of our nations, beseeching us to raise our bastions and borders, to apportion our land and wealth, and to dismantle our institutions. And as this psychic parasite liberates itself from the screen to spread from person to person, covertly embedding itself in each mind and in the ideas and stories that flow therefrom, It corrodes the foundations of power upon which all culture necessarily rests, and eats at the very driving force of life itself, the will to struggle and overcome. Under its spell, the quest for dominance upon which our survival hinges becomes instead the quest to depose ourselves, and our energies are exhausted in striving against the self, as the consummation of the idea overrides even the self-preservation instinct. But what were the conditions that made ethnic Europeans vulnerable to the operation of this mental malware? From its beginnings, the liberal idea which emerged from the collapse of the medieval order had sought to free the autonomous individual from the strictures of tribe, tradition, and history. It aspired to this outcome as a moral imperative on the basis of a belief in the inviolable sovereignty of the human conscience. Within this ethical paradigm, all racial and cultural bonds constitute unjust impositions upon the free person and his unrestricted right to determine his own destiny. Therefore, the self-destructive turn of Western civilization and of the white race was already implicit within the liberal idea, our very identity being an obstacle in the pursuit of its universal emancipatory aims. It only took a capable, determined outside element to perceive liberalism's true nature and work to bring it to its logical conclusion. The purpose of the ideas they perpetuate within our culture is, with few exceptions, to deepen within us the liberal sentiments which they themselves intuitively recognize as a sickness. And as in our efforts to realize these liberal ideals we surrender our wealth and power, they seize it for themselves, unhindered by the enfeebling moral misgivings they have nurtured in our consciousness, but against which they have been inoculated. The source of our disquietude is not the burden of our history or the guilt of its deeds, but the creeping sense that, in relinquishing our birthright, we may have squandered the greatest of gifts. The fear that should we fail to act, the 3,000-year project of our fathers will, within our lifetimes, meet its end.